I want to take us back just for a moment to March of last year. I imagine you have many memories from that month, March of 2020. What a crazy month that was. I remember myself at the beginning of that month, Laura and I, we were in Blacksburg, Virginia at the beginning of March, and we were visiting Jimmy, one of our college kids from Common Good and from our church who was at Virginia Tech. And I remember while we were in Virginia, things felt fairly normal, but then we heard while we were there that Lexington had its first confirmed case of COVID-19, and we're like, well, it's probably not going to be a big deal, we're thinking in our minds, and of course we were wrong. Do y'all remember where you were when you got the news, that Lexington had its first case of COVID-19? I didn't think much of it at the time, and I never would have imagined that this crisis that began would spin out of control just days later. On March 8th, we had church in the sanctuary here as normal Sunday. Then March 9th, the day after, we were at the gathering, and we had our meal and everything at the gathering, and I remember Jeremy sharing some things with us about what he had learned about COVID-19, and I'm like, surely that can't be true. He's giving us some really scary predictions that he had for what might happen, and turns out I think it was worse than what he predicted. But I didn't think it was going to be as bad as it was. Then in the next few days, I'm a basketball fan, and so I saw the NBA start canceling games when one of the players ended up getting COVID-19, and they found out right before a game. Then March Madness was canceled, which freaked us all out, and the dominoes just began to fall. We had our first ever online service at Embrace, never done that before, on March 15th, 2020, and I never imagined that we would be meeting online or outdoors for 16 straight months. The pandemic, as you all know, has been a crisis of epic proportions, and I think Christians in particular have also, in the midst of this, faced probably a lot of crises of faith. I think that we've all kind of experienced on many levels a crisis of faith like nothing we've ever experienced before. We've been forced to really critically evaluate many aspects of our faith and our witness. And one particular issue that I want to talk about today is the issue of God's presence. God's presence. Where is God? How do we experience God? How do we, up top, someone said, I wonder what it would be like to talk with God. These issues of God's presence have been on my mind and heart, and I know many others throughout this past year and a half. Since the pandemic forced us to shelter in place, to social distance, to suspend our in-person worship services, Christians and other religious people all across the world have been wrestling with questions about God's presence and how do we stay connected to God in the midst of such a crisis. For many people, the church building, this actual structure here and the other church buildings across our world are very important to these folks. For some, it really reminds them of God's presence, helps them stay connected to God. Some even view the church, I hear people talk about it as God's house, and believe maybe that God's presence lives in the church in a special way. And so when we couldn't enter into our churches any longer, people had to evaluate the importance and the sacredness of space. Many people ask, is a church building even necessary? Do we need it? Questions around community, communion, baptism, fellowship have consumed our thoughts and have caused many people to question lots about what it means to be a Christian. Is gathering with other Christians even necessary? Do we ever need to come back together? Or can we just do Zoom and online church forever? I hope not. Is a church building necessary? One question we've wrestled with, can Christ be present in communion if we take it privately in our homes? Can I use orange juice and donuts instead of bread and wine? And I don't even know what y'all were using for communion at home, and I'm sure y'all found some interesting things to substitute for the bread and juice we use here. A question I've had to wrestle with is a baptism official if I just flick water on a baby with a branch instead of hold the baby and put water on the baby's head? I've had to do these kinds of baptisms. Where is God when we can't go to church and see these visible signs around us that remind us of God? You know, the experience of a global pandemic in the modern world, this is a new reality for everyone. However, questions about God's presence are very old. And people have been asking these kinds of questions for a very long time. And in fact, ancient Israel was asking questions about God's presence a long time ago, even in these stories that we are reading today. A close reading of our text for today reveals actually a diversity of thought and understanding about God's presence and how God interacted with ancient Israel. And so we're going to be looking at some of that today. We're going to be looking at all of 1 Kings chapter 8. I'm not going to read it all because it is 66 verses, and that would take a while. But I'm going to read kind of the first few verses, and then I'm going to reference some other verses that are important. And so it might be helpful for you. I see some Bibles coming out of the pews. That's great. If you want to get out a Bible and turn to 1 Kings chapter 8, that might be helpful for you. No pressure. We'll have some scripture on the screen as we go along also. I want to say one thing, though, before I read this. A sermon is kind of like a snapshot, all right? So I like to take pictures, and it's kind of, my brother likes to take photos too, and for a period of time we had the exact same camera, and so we would go on a trip together, and we both have our cameras out, like taking photos of the same thing, you know? And it's interesting when we would look back at our pictures, what he took, we would take a picture of the exact same thing, but his would look different than mine. And it's because we were at a different vantage point, and we were looking at the same thing from a slightly different angle, right? And a sermon is kind of like a snapshot of a particular text in the Bible. And so it's just one particular vantage point and way of looking at a text. Another preacher, if I preach a sermon and then Christina comes up and preaches on the same text, or Tanya or Dustin, it's going to be a completely different sermon because we're going to look at it from a slightly different vantage point, and sometimes very different vantage points. And that's a beautiful thing. It's the same text, but just a different way of seeing it. And I wish we could get a 360-degree view of a text and take a snapshot of every single angle and talk about that in a sermon, but that would take a really long time and frankly is impossible to do because there are lots of different ways to read a particular biblical text. And so I can't cover it all in one sermon, and so my hope would be that after you hear us preach a sermon, that would be a spark in your heart and in your mind for then you to go and look at it on your own and say, okay, well, what do I think about this? What is God speaking to me through this text? Get out some books and some things and read about it. Look online, listen to some podcasts or whatever so that you can learn some more about the particular things that we're talking about in church. Because the reality is we're not going to grow and learn if we're just listening to someone kind of tell us something and then we don't think about it anymore after that. It's going to require that study and that digging in throughout the week. And so I want to say this, if anyone ever wants to talk more about a sermon or a particular passage we're looking at, please let me know because I love doing that. And I would love to sit down with you, or we could set up a phone call or whatever to dialogue and talk a little bit about this stuff, because those kinds of conversations give me life. And I know that our other pastors here would love to do that also. And you can just talk about it with your small group as well. So I just wanted to say that before we read this passage. So a lot has happened since Solomon asked God for wisdom last week. All right, we're just talking 2 weeks about Solomon, so we're not going to cover everything, obviously. And so last week we're in 1 Kings chapter 3. Solomon asked God for wisdom, and God gave him the wisdom to make choices so that the community and everyone could benefit. And so a lot's happened, but the most important development that's happened between 1 Kings 3 and 1 Kings 8 is that Solomon finished the construction of the temple. It took many years to complete, and now it's done. And Solomon now holds this big dedication ceremony with all the key players in Israel. It's like when we finish a building here, like a school or something, then you have a big ceremony to open it up. This is what we're talking about here. It's a huge ceremony to unveil the temple and to start putting it to use. And so let me read this text for us. 1 Kings chapter 8, I'm going to read 13 verses, the first 13 verses. So then King Solomon summoned into his presence at Jerusalem the elders of Israel, all the heads of the tribes and the chiefs of the Israelite families, to bring up the ark of the Lord's covenant from Zion, the city of David. All the Israelites came together to King Solomon at the time of the festival in the month of Ethanim, the 7th month. When all the elders of Israel had arrived, the priests took up the ark, and they brought up the ark of the Lord and the tent of meeting and all the sacred furnishings in it. The priests and Levites carried them up, and King Solomon and the entire assembly of Israel that had gathered about him were before the ark, sacrificing so many sheep and cattle that they could not be recorded or counted. And so what we're seeing here is the ark was in Jerusalem, and you hear it keeps saying they brought it up. They brought it up. The temple set up high in Jerusalem, the old city. So the city of Jerusalem already was up on a hill, and then the temple was even higher. And so they're all carrying this ark on these big poles up to the temple. All right? And all the elders, all the leaders of Israel are there. So the priest then brought the ark of the Lord's covenant to its place in the inner sanctuary of the temple, the most holy place, and they put it beneath the wings of the cherubim. The cherubim spread their wings over the place of the ark and overshadowed the ark and its carrying poles. Now these poles were so long that their ends could be seen from the holy place in front of the inner sanctuary, but not from outside the holy place, and there they are still today. Not today, but when this was written, I guess they're saying. There was nothing in the ark except the 2 stone tablets that Moses had placed in it at Horeb, where the Lord made a covenant with the Israelites after they came out of Egypt. When the priest withdrew from the holy place, the cloud filled the temple of the Lord, and the priests could not perform their service because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled his temple. Then Solomon said, "The Lord has said that he would dwell in a dark cloud. I have indeed built a magnificent temple for you, a place for you to dwell forever." And next what happens is Solomon gives a speech to all the people, and then he prays a very long prayer, and after that he blesses the people, and then finally it says he offers this massively large number of sacrifices. All right, so that is what happens in 1 Kings chapter 8. So let me say something about the temple. Before the temple was built, Jews would worship God in all different places throughout Jerusalem, or throughout the nation of Israel. We read about before that Solomon would worship God at the high places. And so often Israelites would go and worship God at different high places throughout the nation. But often other gods were also worshipped at these high places. And so building this temple was important because it became kind of the central place where only Yahweh, the God of Israel, would be worshipped. And so in a way, building the temple was a unifying thing for Israel to give them one centralized place where everybody was invited to come and worship God. The temple became a central aspect of the Israelite faith. Many people referred to it as God's house. This was a central and very important place for them. It also, at the same time, provoked a bit of a faith crisis for many Israelites who were seeking to understand God's presence among them and how they would have access to God and be in communion with the God of Israel. And in these verses, we find 5 different understandings of God's presence as it relates to the temple and the Ark of the Covenant. And it's very subtle ways that these come out in the text, but I want to point them out to you because it's very interesting, and I think you'll find it interesting. And so the fact that Israel was struggling to understand God's presence ought to invite us today to think and meditate on God's mysterious and powerful presence in our world right now. And so let me break these down for you. It's going to be through kind of 5 different themes that come out in this text that I think are very fascinating. So just bear with me. We'll break this down, all right? So first, we're going to talk about the Ark of the Covenant. Now, the Ark is interesting. It was constructed a long time before this text was the events in this text. It was constructed by Moses while Israel wandered in the desert. Now, the Ark, I find it fascinating that it talked a lot about the poles in this text for the Ark. I don't know if that stuck out to you, but it did to me. But the Ark had these large poles that they would kind of likely hold like this, and they would carry it as they traveled from place to place. The poles were there probably so they didn't have to touch the Ark, and also it provided a way for them to carry it around. And so when they would travel throughout the wilderness, as they wandered through the desert, they would take the Ark with them everywhere they went. They also would take the tabernacle, which was a mobile tent that they traveled with them as well. And so the Ark would be underneath the tabernacle. At times, the Ark kind of exudes this power. It aided the Israelites in battle, apparently. Some texts point that out, that when they would take it to battle, it would help them gain victory. It also caused havoc for the Philistines when they stole it at one point, and it just kind of wreaked havoc on them and their community. The Ark was to be handled with great care and great reverence. So the Ark was really, people believed God's presence was there, residing in that Ark. And so the Ark really points to God's presence being mighty, very mobile. It was not fixed to a particular location, very mysterious and beyond control. So the Ark was a very important thing to them. Now, I want to point out the second thing is what was inside the Ark. Other people in Israel did not view the Ark as being so mysterious. The comment in verse 9 is very illuminating and interesting. It says that there was nothing in the Ark except 2 stone tablets that Moses had placed in it at Horeb. There was nothing in it except the commandments of God, because the stone tablets were what the 10 commandments were written on. And so some people believed that God's presence was experienced through obedience. And so these folks likely thought of the Ark not as so mysterious, it's just a box, and what's really important is what's inside the box. And what is inside the box is the 10 commandments, and if you want to be close to God, if you want to experience God's presence, then you need to follow the Torah. You need to follow God's commandments. That is how you get close to God, is through obedience. The third thing I want to mention is the cloud that filled the temple. So during the ceremony, it says that a dark cloud filled the temple. Now, if y'all have read much in the Old Testament, you probably have seen this dark cloud appear at other places throughout the Old Testament. The cloud was viewed as it's really an ancient sign of God's presence. And we see this cloud particularly all throughout the book of Exodus. And like the Ark, the cloud really points to a mysterious God that is on the move, because a cloud is very mysterious, right? It's not like an image of God. It's just this dark cloud, and the cloud would come and go. They could not control the cloud. The cloud was representing this mysterious and mobile God. The cloud is not fixed or trapped in any human creation. However, Solomon wanted the cloud to stay in the temple. It says that then Solomon said, "The Lord has said that he would dwell in a dark cloud. He's like, well, the dark cloud's here. It's exciting, right? God is there. And he says, I have indeed built this magnificent temple for you, Lord, a place for you to dwell forever. God is a mysterious God on the move, yet Solomon was praying this prayer that God would permanently stay in the temple. And he probably had many motivations for this. Some of this was practical. Some of it may be political, because if God stayed in the temple and didn't move about, then he could maybe control God a little bit, because God's temple was right near his palace. Maybe he thought if God dwelled permanently in the temple, that would bless Israel, because he knew that the God of Israel was there in Israel for good. And so Solomon prayed this prayer, this hopeful prayer for himself and his kingdom, that the God that was mobile and on the move and very mysterious would take up residence permanently in the temple that he had built for God. And from this time on, many people grew to believe that God actually lived in the temple and that God's presence was now tied to this actual physical location. There was actually another view, though, and this is God's name was in the temple instead of God actually living in the temple. In verse 29, Solomon quotes God saying, "My name will be there." Some folks believed that God didn't actually live in the temple, but that his name was there in the temple. And this would be very different, because maybe God didn't actually live there, but having his name there still would have been very important. And that would mean that God would pay special attention to the temple, because God's name would give it authority, that this place would be special and important. And so anyone who went to the temple to pray, anyone who looked towards the temple to pray, would then be able to hear God's voice perhaps, or maybe God would hear their voice. It could be a vehicle for connecting with God. And so for some, maybe they didn't believe that God actually lived inside of this building, but that it was an important place. It was a sacred and holy place where they could have a unique connection to God. Now, the fifth thing I want to point out is that heaven is in fact God's dwelling place. In chapter 8, verse 30, Solomon says, "Oh, here in heaven, your dwelling place." He's talking to God and he's saying, God, hear me in heaven. And he's kind of pointing out there that heaven perhaps is your dwelling place. And so Solomon has kind of thrown a bone and acknowledged all the different understandings of God's presence. He has clearly expressed his desire that God would permanently live in the beautiful temple that he had built for God. However, at the end, he must acknowledge that perhaps God is too big to live in the temple. And he even goes so far as to say that God maybe is too big to even live just in heaven, because God is so big and mighty and mysterious and powerful. Solomon seems to conclude at the end of all this that while the temple is very special and very holy, God cannot be contained to any human structure or any other place. No worship service, no ritual, no obedient action, or anything else can contain or control God's presence, because God is free to be God and beyond human control. This chapter, it really shows us that God is very mysterious and cannot be fully grasped or understood. That God's presence, they were kind of working that out in real time. Solomon was probably a very political man, and he also knew that lots of different understandings were there, and so he's kind of mentioning lots of different understandings of God's presence. And I think that the idea that people were struggling to figure it out really points to the fact that God's presence is very hard to understand. But one thing it seems Solomon was sure of, that was that God desired to be connected with his people, and that God wanted to be present among his people. Solomon was so confident that God was listening. He was confident that God would respond to an obedient and humble heart. You know, regardless of where the Jews came down on all this debate about God's presence, the temple certainly represented the fact that God desired to be among his people. The temple, in reality, was supposed to be a house of prayer for all nations. It was supposed to be a place that people could come visit and look toward to seek restoration and forgiveness and life. It was supposed to be an inclusive place, a place where people could come and meet the God Yahweh. However, as we see throughout the story of God, the religious and the political leaders, they often sought to control God. They sought to control others through their unjust practices at the temple. By the time Jesus came in the first century, many years later, the temple had really become a place of exclusion, a place of injustice, a place of oppression. It was very clear who was allowed to be there, who was not allowed to be there. Jesus went so far as to refer to the temple as a den of robbers. The place that was meant to help people connect to the God of Israel and experience this mighty and free and untamable presence of God had become a tool of exploitation, a tool of greed, a tool of control. Earlier in the year, I don't know if y'all remember, but we studied the book of Mark. That feels like a long time ago. And we talked about how Mark talks about the gospel and the incarnation of Jesus. And he describes really Jesus' mission as an invasion into enemy territory. Do y'all remember that? That Jesus' mission was an invasion. At Jesus' baptism, we see this. At his baptism, the writer of Mark talks about how the heavens were ripped open. In the incarnation for Mark, he doesn't talk about the birth narrative. He doesn't talk about the sweet baby and all that kind of thing. For Mark, the story of the incarnation is not a sweet story of a baby's birth, but instead it's the free and mighty God ripping open the heavens, engaging in cosmic battle against the evil powers and principalities. In the Gospel of Mark, we talked about, it's kind of like the heavens have been opened up and God is now on the loose. And for some, that's encouraging, but for others, that's terrifying to think of the mighty God being on the loose in the world. Throughout the ministry of Jesus, we see that God cannot be controlled. God cannot be put into a box. God cannot be kind of put off into a corner and only used when we need Him. God cannot be manipulated, bound, or gagged. Perhaps the religious authorities at the time of Jesus thought that they were secure. They thought that God was on their side. Maybe that they had successfully kept God at bay in the temple. Or maybe kept God was kind of ambivalent up in heaven, not really worried about what was happening down below. And so they had gotten very prideful and started taking advantage of people and start using their faith as a tool for exploitation and a tool for hurting others instead of it being a tool to bring people together and show them God's love. It's almost like God said to them, "No more." You think I'm content and ambivalent up in heaven? Well, I'm tearing open the skies and I'm coming down. You think you have me locked up in the ark in the temple? I'm tearing the dividing curtain apart and I'm leaving that place. The New Testament writers make it abundantly clear that God's presence is on the loose in the world, that God's Spirit is moving and working all around us, even inside of us. And this means that we can experience God's presence anywhere because His Spirit is on the loose. You know, certainly there are special places that feel extra holy to us. This church may be that for some of you. Maybe there's a place out in the wilderness where you feel extra close to God. And that's good. But we also need to remember that every place has the opportunity to be holy. Any moment has an opportunity to be a holy moment because God is not confined to any place, any spiritual practice, any moment. God is on the loose and He is everywhere. Brother Lawrence, not our Brother Lawrence who attends Embrace, who's not here this morning, but a different Brother Lawrence who lived in the 17th century. He was a monk, And he encouraged followers of Jesus to what he called practice the presence of God. And he wrote this just spiritual classic about this very thing. But Brother Lawrence argued that you could really practice the presence of God in any moment, any time, any place, no matter where you are, no matter what you're doing. You could experience God's presence, and that moment could, in fact, be a holy moment for you. He understood that holiness and meaning were available in the common, everyday business of life. Brother Lawrence is known to wash a lot of dishes and do a lot of very routine, mundane tasks, and he was able somehow to find God's presence and make those holy moments. I want to read a quote for you by him, which is interesting to me. And in a way, it's quite radical. And he's talking about God. He says, He does not ask much of us, merely a thought of Him from time to time, a little act of adoration, sometimes to ask for His grace, sometimes to offer Him your sufferings, at other times to thank Him for the graces past and present He has bestowed on you, in the midst of your troubles to take solace in Him as often as you can. He says, lift up your heart to Him during your meals and in company. The least little remembrance will always be the most pleasing to Him. And I love this last part. He says, one need not cry out very loudly. He is nearer to us than we think. It says, one need not cry out very loudly. He is nearer to us than we think. What Brother Lawrence reminds me of is that God is with us on our journeys. And that if we are mindful, if we cultivate this spiritual practice of mindfulness and being aware of God's presence in all the different aspects of our life, then I believe we can find God in so many different places. So I encourage you to be mindful of God's presence wherever you find yourself. At work, on the soccer field, at the gym, on the street, at the park, in the kitchen, while you do your chores, on a walk, at school, while you're taking a test, at church, while you're teaching. God is there. God is nearer to us than we think. You know, I like to think about the Bible really as the story of God becoming more and more present to His people. And we see that the temple was a step in the right direction. It was creating this centralized place where people knew they could go and they would be able to be confident that God was listening to them, that be confident that they could experience some piece of God's presence there in this place. But throughout the story of God, we see that that wasn't enough, that God had bigger plans. It wasn't just about the temple, and it wasn't just about Israel. It was about everyone. And so we see in the story of God that when Jesus came, that was obviously a huge step towards His people. God ripped open the heavens and He came down and walked among us. And He showed us in flesh and bone what it looked like, what God was like and what God cared about. And people actually got to know Jesus and talk to Him and experience Him. And then even more so, after Jesus left, we were given the gift of the Holy Spirit. And God's Spirit has been let loose all throughout our world. And God is closer to us than we could ever imagine. So I want you all to know that God is near. Sometimes I start to believe and I start to feel like God is very, very, very far from me. Have y'all ever believed that? Do any of you all feel like that this morning, perhaps, that God is far from you? Often I feel that way, and I felt that way even very recently. And unfortunately, over the last couple of days, I've had some good moments with God where I've been reminded, and God has kind of reminded me that He's nearer to me than perhaps I think. I used to think that as I kind of wandered away from God or kind of went my own path, I went this way, and God kept going this way, and eventually we just get further and further and further and further apart. And it's like I'm here, and God's all the way back there, and I'm like, how will I ever make up this distance between me and you? You know? Have y'all ever felt like that before? And it feels like I have to go on a big journey just to get back to God. And sometimes that journey feels too much. It feels like too much for some because they feel so far. And they're like, I can never make it back to God. And then sometimes we just stop trying. But I think the reality of the gospel and what Scripture teaches us is that we don't have to make a long journey. We don't have to travel a long, long journey to get to a temple or to get to some place where God is going to be super close to us. The reality is that God is pursuing us, that God is right there. And what I've grown to learn over my years of living is that when I kind of wander away from God, God stops in His tracks and He follows me. and He's right there. And He's willing to go down even the dark paths that we often walk down. And often what I need to do is just turn around and realize God's right there. And He's been there all along. And so I know we took a strange path maybe to get to this message, but I want you all to know that God is present to you and God loves you and that God is here among us this morning and that you can experience Him today and throughout your day and throughout your week. And so if you need to get back to God, I just want to encourage you, you don't have to try that hard. You just need to tell God, I need you. And then start that journey again, and God's going to be right there with you to continue walking with you on that path.